What's up everyone, welcome back to the shop. Today we're going to talk about Alabama rigs. So in today's video we're going to go through the different things that I do to catch more fish on an Alabama rig. Whether that's hook selection, rod and reel, the baits that I use, anything like that. We're gonna go through everything and tell you everything you need to know about catching fish on Alabama rigs. So starting out, an Alabama rig is a 5-wired bait. It's basically got a head with 5 wires coming from it. There's some different variations of it where some of the states have laws that say you can only throw 3 wires or things like that. So they have variations where some of them only have 3 wires. They have some that are bigger, some that are smaller. So there's all kinds of different Alabama rigs that you can throw. So before we get into this, it's important to check your rules and regulations in every state, as well as the tournaments you're fishing. Some tournaments will ban this, like I know Bass and some of the Bass Nation stuff. You're not allowed to throw Alabama rigs at some of the tournaments. The MLF, you're allowed to throw them, but there are certain rules as far as the number of blades, number of wires, and number of baits. So you want to make sure that you always are checking for each tournament trail and for each state that you're fishing, because it changes quite frequently. So the bait that I throw all the time, and I've thrown some smaller ones and I've thrown some bigger ones, but the main bait that I throw is the Yum Flash Mob Junior. And so they make a full-size Yum Alabama rig, but this is the smaller version of it. It's kind of a middle of the road. It's not huge, but it's not tiny like some of the little bitty Alabama rigs out there. What I like to do with this is I basically like to fish it around laydowns, around brush piles, bluff walls. It works really great in the wintertime and early spring. And you don't have to have live scope to catch fish on this. I mean, this has been around before live scope, and guys were wearing them out. And then eventually the fish got kind of accustomed to it, and people don't throw it as much now, I feel like, as they did the first couple of years with the Alabama rig. So it may start being a deal where the fish start biting a little bit better on it. I use the Flash Mob Junior for 90% of the time when I'm fishing an Alabama rig. I will modify it accordingly to however I want to fish, the type of cover that I'm fishing around, the depth that I want to fish it in, and I will basically modify that Flash Mob Junior to anything that I want to do. So the first thing that you'll notice is all of these Flash Mob Juniors come with 4 little bitty blades. And I think it's like a 2 or a 2.5 size blade. They're on the outside wires of this Alabama rig. So what that'll do is that'll add a little bit of flash to your bait as it's coming through the water. Some guys like the spinner bait blades, some guys don't. I personally like to throw them most of the time, unless I'm in certain situations. I'll throw them without the blades. So for example, MLF has a rule where you can only have 5 blades on a rig, and so there will be times where I will put blades on the top 2 wires, and if I do that, it'll make it 6 blades. So what I'll do is I'll cut some of these off, but you don't want to cut just one of them off. So like for example, if I would cut just one of them off to get down to that number of 5, if I do that, then my Alabama rig will be uneven and it'll kind of roll and swim sideways. So what I'll do is I'll have to cut off either the top 2 or the bottom 2 to keep it even, because you don't want to get this thing out of balance, otherwise it's going to run crooked. So let's just kind of go down some of the modifications that I do with this to cover different conditions and different times that I'll fish different variations of this Alabama rig. So the main 3 ways that I fish an Alabama rig is I fish with either 5 hooks and 5 jig heads, or I fish with 2 dummies on the top, or I fish with 2 blades on the top. And the reason I do that is based off of the laws in each state, and also based off of the depth that I want to fish and the type of cover that I'm fishing around. So the reason that I would put these blades on here would be to add a little bit of lift to the bait. So by putting a blade up top here, it's gonna put a little bit more resistance as you're reeling it through the water, and that's going to create a lot more lift on the Alabama rig, so it'll keep the bait up higher in the water column. So if the fish are suspended and you're using that live scope to target individual fish, and you want to keep that bait up, so say they're in 5 foot of water and you have this big bait that has big heavy jig heads on it, or decent sized jig heads on it, and you throw that out there, it's hard to keep that bait up. But with a blade on here, it'll allow it to have a little bit more lift and stay higher and keep it above the fish, because that's the key when you're fishing an Alabama rig, is you want to keep it above fish. Honestly, that's the key with any type of fishing, is if your bait gets below the fish, majority of the time they're not going to go after it, they're not going to keep chasing it or whatever. You got to keep your bait above the fish, because those fish are constantly looking up and trying to feed on bait fish. That's just how bass feed in general. You want to keep your bait above the fish. So as far as blade size, normally whenever I add a blade to the tops of these, I'll use just a standard like number 4 blade, and that works pretty good for what I need it to do. It is a decent size, but if you really want to create more drag, obviously you can use a bigger blade. So this is a number 5. If you put that on there, it's gonna just create more drag. You could try messing with like a Colorado blade or different things that create more of a lift than the willow blade, but normally probably 95% of the time I'm throwing a willow blade on my Alabama rigs. Another thing you could do is you could mess with color. So if you're fishing like Dale Hollow, Cumberland, some of those lakes are really good lakes for like colored spinnerbaits, and essentially an Alabama rig is just a giant spinnerbait. So if you throw a colored blade on the top of that, you may be able to get a couple extra strikes. So then also, if you're wanting a little bit more flash, but you're wanting the bait to get down a little bit farther, so you want that blade, but you don't want it to have as much lift, you can downsize it and go with this number 3. And what that'll do is it's essentially just adding a little bit more flash than what we have here, but it's going to not hold the bait up as high in the water column. So just kind of play with that. If you have live scope, you can kind of see how high the bait is, and basically do some experimenting based on the blade size to see which blade size works best for you on that day. If you don't have live scope, then you can count your bait down. If you have clear water, you can see how fast your bait is falling. Or if you're in 10 foot of water, a lot of times what I'll do is I'll find a flat area, and if I'm in 10 foot of water and I know it's 10 foot out where I cast, if you throw your bait out there and you count it down, that'll allow you to see how fast your bait falls and gets to the bottom. So as far as the dummies, I always put my dummies on a hitchhiker. Owner makes these little screw lock hitchhiker things, and I'll take it and screw into my soft plastic, and then I will put my snap onto that hitchhiker. A lot of times I will actually take some super glue and add it onto that too, and that'll hold those things on really tight, and you'll be replacing your other hooks a lot faster than you'll be replacing these. And you don't want these to just constantly be pulling out, because it'll get really frustrating. So you want to make sure that your dummies are on the top. If your dummies are running on the bottom, a lot of times those fish are going to come up from the bottom and they're going to hit, and if you don't have hooks on those baits, then you're going to miss that fish. So I want to make sure that I have my weight down at the bottom and your dummies are at the top. And then having 5 jig heads is pretty self-explanatory. I basically just do the same thing I did with the bottom 3, but I put them up top. I like to keep my jig head size pretty consistent. I usually throw the exact same heads on one Alabama rig. So for example, this one here has all 1/8 ounce heads. So I got 3 1/8 ounce heads on there. And this one here has all 1/4 ounce heads. So I have 3 1/4 ounce heads on there. And what that does is it allows me to fish this one a little bit deeper. If I go and I'm going fishing for the day and I know I'm going to throw an Alabama rig a lot, I'll have one Alabama rig with 1/4 ounce heads, one with 1/8 ounce heads. That way I could cover 2 different areas, and I'm able to basically pick up the heavier one if I need to get a little bit deeper and get on those fish. So we'll get into like rods and reels and the jig heads that I use, different baits that I use here in a little bit. But first, let's talk about the different types of cover that I fish. And I kind of touched on this a little bit before, but let's kind of break it down a little bit more. The Alabama rig has a lot of drawing power, and you really got to see this once Live Scope came out, and you could see that you could throw this thing at any fish, and a lot of times they're going to follow it. Whether they eat it or not is a different story, because a lot of times they'll follow it and it's really frustrating. But they follow this thing really good. So there'll be times where you see a stump on Live Scope or a brush pile, or even if you see a laydown, if you visually see a laydown on the bank and you throw this thing at that laydown or brush pile or stump, the fish will follow it out of there. So if you don't see a fish on Live Scope, you could still pull fish out of like brush piles and things like that you didn't even know were there. So that's pretty cool, is you can throw this thing up there and just slow roll it real slow. I throw mine on real low speed gear ratio reels, and I'm able to just slow crawl that through brush piles right over the top of them. It's kind of frustrating sometimes because you get stuck a lot, but obviously because you got 3 hooks. But if you figure out how to kind of feather that through those laydowns and brush piles and stumps and all that stuff, you're able to really draw those fish out of that cover and get a lot of bites. Speaking of getting bites, a lot of times what I'll do is I will kind of vary my retrieve. I'll slow roll it, and then I'll just kind of like do a half turn real quick. And what that does, just like a real quick half turn like that, and just throw 1 or 2 of them in every once in a while. And what that does is it really makes this bait just flare. So it's just coming along, just not really doing much, just kind of swim bait tails flickering. And then whenever you do that, the whole thing just like flares out. And a lot of times if you have a follower, those fish will just crush that bait whenever you flare it like that. So just that half turn can really make a huge difference. And then as far as speed that I fish the bait, it depends on the depth. A lot of times I like to slow roll the bait, but you don't want it to get under the fish, like I said earlier. So if I am fishing shallower, I want to keep reeling it a little bit faster. And then obviously in the wintertime, you're going to want to fish that bait a lot slower than you would in the summertime or fall or spring. So in those warmer months, those fish are a lot more active, and you're able to reel the bait a lot faster without deterring those fish from biting. So as far as rods and reels, I have 2 rods that I throw my Alabama rigs on. One of them's a lighter rod, and a lot of times I'll throw my 1/8 ounce ones on that rod. And then I have another rod that's a bigger rod that is, it's kind of like a glide bait rod, but it also works for Alabama rig. It works pretty good for some of those heavier ones. It'll also work with the lighter ones, but both of them are really good rods for an Alabama rig because they have a little bit of a tip so that whenever those fish do end up biting, they kind of hook themselves. And that's kind of one thing, is if you set the hook on like a stump or something, there's a good chance you won't get it out. But if you just kind of just keep reeling and then you get hung up, a lot of times that bait, once you get onto the other side of it, will come out even though there's 3 hooks. Or if you throw a lure retriever out or something, you've got a lot better chance of getting that out. But if you swing and set the hook on everything you hit down there, it will you'll lose a lot of Alabama rigs. So a lot of times what I'll do whenever I get to fishing is I will feel a bite, and instead of really setting the hook, I kind of just pull, and then when I know it's a bite, then I really set the hook into them. So I like to throw, and this rod is it's from Lew's. It's a custom light. It's actually a Magnum jig rod, but it's a 7'3" medium heavy rod with a moderate fast tip. And that rod, it's pretty much sets up really good for fishing jigs and stuff like that, but I also use it for my Alabama rigs. So that is one of the rods that I throw. And then this is a Revo winch. It's got a low gear ratio. It's like a 5.4 to 1 or a 5.3 to 1 gear ratio. This is actually one of the really older ones, and I still use it for all my Alabama rigs. or if I'm throwing deep cranking and stuff like that, I'll use either this or like a Lew's BB1. But I like to throw this reel, and I have a newer Revo winch over here, a newer generation. Both of these are the ones that I'll throw on my Alabama rig. I'll spool those up with 20-pound Berkeley fluorocarbon, and that line is pretty dang tough. That's about all you need, honestly, for slinging these things around. So that 7.3 medium heavy with a moderate fast tip is the one that I throw with some of my lighter Alabama rigs. And my bigger ones, like I said, is like a glide umbrella rig and a glide bait. This is a Dobbins Fury, and it's an 8-foot heavy fast action tip. This rod is perfect for any swim baits that I'm throwing, all of my Alabama rigs that I throw, and I throw that with a Revo winch as well. And the reason that these things are so good is they got a really big spool so I can launch them out there. When you put 20-pound test on a reel, a lot of times it takes up a lot of the spool and you can't make as long a cast. So I want to have a big spool and a low gear ratio whenever I choose a reel. So this 8-foot rod is what I'll use on like my 1/4 ounce, or if I go any bigger and head size and I want to really launch that thing out. But like I said earlier, it's got that tip to where I can kind of pull into the fish and they kind of hook themselves with these hooks, and then I can really yank on them and drive those hooks home. So as far as hooks that I use, I actually pour my own jig heads, and the ones that I use is I basically buy a Gamakatsu hook, and I will pour just regular ball head jigs. And I pour 1/8 ounce, 1/4 ounce, and then I'll use 2/0 and 4/0 hooks. And the 2/0s will be for like my little bitty 2.8 Kitech. So a lot of times whenever I'm fishing around small bait fish, if I'm throwing a 2.8 Kitech, I need that smaller hook. Otherwise, I won't be able to fish this bait without like being all the way back in the tail. So I throw the 2/0 with these really small swim baits, but the majority of the time I'll throw a 4/0 on my middle of the road ones. So this is a 1/8 ounce with a 4/0 hook, and that's what I'll throw on pretty much all of the middle of the road Kitech sizes. So we got 3.3, 3.8, 4.3, and 4.8. And I'll throw the 4/0 hook on pretty much all of those. It's a little bit small for this 4.8. So sometimes I'll upgrade and throw a bigger hook like this Squadron swim bait head from Strike King. If I want a little bit of a heavier head, or if I want a bigger hook for a bigger bait like this, a lot of times I'll upgrade to that because I don't pour any of the heavier sizes or the bigger hooks. So majority of the time I'll use the 1/8 ounce or the 1/4 ounce, and then I'll use either the 2/0 or the 4/0 heads. And that's why I make those and just pour ball head jigs so that I can go through a bunch of them. A lot of times they'll get stuck on rocks or something, and it'll bend the tips over on the points of my hooks. So I go through a lot of jig heads, so I like to pour those on my own, and it saves me a lot of money that way. Another thing that you can do is you can throw these weedless twist locks, and this is a hook from Owner. A lot of the other brands make them, but I like to, sometimes when I'm fishing around really heavy cover, what I'll do is I'll take one of these. It's an 1/8 ounce with a 5/0 hook, and you can just rig this up and put 3 or 5 or however many you want on your Alabama rig. Basically just twist that twist lock in, and then you're going to Texpose that like such, and you have a weedless Alabama rig, which is really cool. You just throw those, if you throw 3 or 5 or however many you're allowed to throw on this Alabama rig, you can really throw that into some thick stuff and just wind it through like a full lay down and possibly get some more bites like that. So like if the fish are really tight to cover in a day, Sometimes I'll throw this little owner twist lock, and it's an 1/8 ounce with a 5/0, and it works really good for getting into some really thick stuff with an Alabama rig. So let's talk about the baits that I throw. A lot of times I throw a Kitech the majority of the time, and I already had these all out, but there's a bunch of different sizes of Kitechs that you can throw. And I'll talk about some of the colors that I like the best. So as you can see, the Kitech Fats come in a bunch of different sizes, and this bait works really good on just a single hook, but it works really good on an Alabama rig as well. So I throw this one the majority of the time, but I also mix in some of the other swim baits to give the fish a little bit of a different look. This comes in a 2.8, 3.3, 3.8, 4.3, and 4.8. And these are some of the colors that I like. And obviously there's a bunch of colors that you can use. Sometimes I'll throw a white one. The white is really good for a little bit muddier water. And that's one thing that I didn't talk about earlier, but a lot of times in my middle one, I'll throw something a little bit different, whether it's a little bit bigger of a swim bait or a different colored swim bait. So in this case, you'll see they're the same size, but I have a different colored. So this is Pro Blue Red Pearl, and these are all Bluegill Flash. And so by throwing that different color, it gives those fish something to key on. And you want those fish to find, if they see a ball of bait and they see something different, that'll sometimes make those fish just react and eat that bait. Some of the colors that I like are this Rainbow Shad. It's got a lot of it's like a rainbow flake in it, essentially. It's some gold, some purple, some black flake on it, but that color is really good. The Bluegill Flash has got a darker back with some gold and some blue flake in it. The Electric Shad is a color that works really good on certain days. And then Pro Blue Red Pearl is also one of my favorites. So a lot of times on the clearer days, I'll throw one of these colors with all the flake in it. So like Electric Shad, Bluegill Flash, or the Rainbow Shad on the clearer days. And then on the cloudier days, I'll throw more of a Pro Blue Red Pearl or something that's, or even a white if the water's a little bit muddier. A lot of times those fish will eat a white bait too, even in clearer water. So it's something to try. Even if you don't think they'll eat the white, throw it on there, make a few casts, and you may be surprised that those fish will hit that. Some of the other baits, other than the Kitech that I throw, some of the smaller ones, and then we'll get into a few of the bigger ones. So this is a Big Bite Cane Thumper, and this is a white one like I was just talking about. It's a really good bait. It's got a different style tail to it, and it's got a lot more resistance whenever you're fishing it through the water. So that's a bait that can put off a little bit more vibration in a little bit muddier water and possibly get you a few more bites if you're fishing that muddier water or cloudier, nasty day like that. And you could throw this bait and possibly pick up a few more bites. Another thing you could do is you don't have to throw the same bait on each one of these. You want to make sure that it's running straight and everything is weighted the same. So you could throw that bait in the middle of two Kitechs on the bottom. So you can just mix and match this all you want and just kind of experiment with it, because really the options are endless with an Alabama rig. Another bait that I've done really well with on an Alabama rig, especially whenever it first came out, was this Zoom Swimming Fluke. And it comes in the Zoom Swimming Fluke Junior and then a Swimming Fluke full size, like a standard one. And that bait, this is Arkansas Shiner and this is Albino. Those two colors are my two favorite. And then also I have a white one that I'll throw a lot, and I'll throw the white one like in the middle or something to get those fish to react. But those two colors and that different style of swim bait sometimes will get you more bites. So a lot of times like I said, if I have two Alabama rigs on, one of them might have one style of swim bait, one of them might have the Kitechs, or vice versa. But another swim bait that I've caught a lot of fish on is this Missile Baits Shockwave. And it's a really thin bait, but it works really good. So it's got this little bitty tail on it that creates a lot of action as it goes through the water. Just got a little bit of a different action than like the Kitech or the Zoom swimming fluke. So then if you're on big fish fisheries like Gunnersville or any of the Tennessee River stuff, a lot of guys throw these big hollow belly swim baits. And with this hollow belly, it's basically like the name says, the inside of it is hollow. So it's a little bit different style than the solid ones. So I like to throw, I don't throw my 1/8 ounce heads on those. I'll throw like a squadron head or even a different type of swim bait head that I would normally throw these on just like by themselves if I was throwing an individual swim bait. And so I'll take like a heavier 3/8 and a bigger hook, and I want to make sure that hook is big enough to get back in here a little bit better, whereas my homemade ones just don't work very good in this. But these hollow bellies will have a different action than the solid body ones. So sometimes if you're on those where you got big gizzard shad around, or if you're fishing around bridges or something like that, like Gunnersville, a lot of guys do that, that's when these big hollow bellies will come in handy. And this is a Bass Tricks Blue Gizzard Shad, and this one is from Berkeley. It's a Berkeley hollow belly swim bait, and it's in Tennessee shad. So both of those are really good options if you're wanting a bigger profile when you get around some of those bigger gizzard shad, and you could put 3 of them on there and this bait becomes a really big bait, and it's targeting really big fish. So those are just a few of the baits that I like to throw on it, but the Alabama rig can be really effective. A lot of times what I'll do is I will see a fish on live scope if it's just suspended, and I'll toss it and then make sure you cast past it and just kind of reel that bait to the fish. And like I said earlier, you want to stay above the fish, or else those fish will kind of veer off, or you'll hit them with your line and they'll get scared. Those fish are getting really smart with live scope, and people targeting them like that, it's really not an easy thing to do. I will basically fish suspended fish like that, or I'll fish through cover like I was talking about earlier with brush piles. And drawing fish out of the cover is really effective way to catch a lot of big fish, and especially in the wintertime when the fishing's a little bit tougher. But hopefully you guys like this video. Be sure to like and subscribe, and we'll see you guys next time.